labor studies program.
Hey, and I'm Olivia. I'm the one that's been emailing you all. So thank you so much for bearing with me and coming today and for all of your feedback. I've been helping with editing and research along the way.
Yeah, Deepak, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's great to be in a powerful group for this conversation. Deepak Pataria, formerly of Community Change for last almost 10 years until last summer, and previously was in labor movement at SEIU and UFCW for quite some time, and was community organizer in Los Angeles way before that. Sort of made my way around a bit, and I guess one thing I would say is about the book, the ways in which you all throughout and then near the end kind of are making this point about the interaction, if you will, or sort of the combination, kind of the synergy among the models. I'm really interested in that and how to bring a sort of harsh strategic lens to that, as opposed to the, you know, everybody's awesome and everything that everybody does is good and let's do more of everything, which, you know, you all made that point, but I'm curious about how to sort of sharpen that, because there's a big risk of people hearing the everything is good part and not your other cautions about actually, no, everything isn't good.
Okay, Kevin.
Hey y'all, nice to see you. Kevin Simwitz, he, him pronouns. I am the co-director of the House Us Fund and help with this project called All Due Respect around recruiting and retaining more organizers, and consult on a bunch of different projects. Yeah, I think for today, I'd be really interested in digging in a little bit on where the book tries to understand the opposition without setting up the framework that we should just do what the opposition has done as our playbook. And like where the parallel structure between what we're doing and the opposition works and doesn't work as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Samir?
Hey everyone, Samir Santi. I also teach at SLU with Stephanie and Deepak. I have here, I should say, I'm sorry I didn't send them. I have lots of written comments that I'll send you after this, which I may revise based on this discussion. But I think the thing I like Deepak, the thing I'm maybe most interested in discussing is, again, how concretely we can envision these various things coming together and being as kind of specific as possible in that treatment. Yeah, but very much looking forward to it.
Great. Lissy.
Hey everyone, I'm Lissy, she, her. Until last month, I was the executive director of Momentum, training organization that teaches one of the models in the book, or a version of that model. And before that was a community organizer in Massachusetts. And I think what I would love to dig into today, if there's time, is the conjunctural analysis tool. And I will pass it to Dominique.
Hey y'all, Dominique, pronouns are she and her. I'm the field building director at Industrious Labs. It's a climate organizing organization. And one thing that I'm really thinking about is this idea of organizing the unorganized and like what that process really looks like. And more specifically, how to use the different strategies to build a multiracial cross-class movement in climate. And what does that, like, what does it look like and what does it mean to embody that? Because I think in climate, we're so often in an echo chamber talking to folks who believe and think the same things as us. And so what does it look like to actually organize the unorganized? And I'll pass to Kyle.
Hey, thanks so much. The Deputy Director of Race and Democracy at the Roosevelt Institute, also work at the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State part-time. Really appreciated the book. And one of the things I'm interested in is this concept around the types of coalitions that you're forming based on the fights ahead, right? Especially with the rising authoritarianism that we're facing, how we're able to build and stitch together very disparate coalitions and in very times very opposing coalitions. There's a lot there that you've mentioned, but I'm also interested in like how the different tools or tabletop exercises might help to kind of get across and organize to confront some of these big challenges and scenario planning that we're going to have to confront against and organize new people into. So looking forward to that conversation as well. And then I don't know if Greg.
Hey folks, real excited to be in this conversation, and Deepak, Stephanie, thanks for all the work on the book. Really good to read. I think the two big pieces I'd love to have a chance to talk about a little bit today is sort of at the theory level, kind of Gramsci and how that's how you guys used it and thought about it, and kind of how that mushes in with the reality of organizing nowadays in the US. So that's kind of one area. And then the second is just really thinking about and wanting to hear from you guys, how do you want to use this book as an intervention on the movement right now? Because obviously, you guys doing it as a class is amazing and awesome. So this is going to be out in the public sphere. And so where do you want to push it? Anyway, just love to hear a little bit more from you on that. I had a couple of thoughts too about how it could weave into stuff that I see.
Wow. Amazing. It's fantastic. I think that's everybody, right? So, okay, so I'll just picking up from there. Well, maybe we can first answer Greg's question. Does that work? Which is to build on what came up for us in the last session we talked with folks was that, we do have a tension here that we're trying to play the role of teacher, but we're also coming from an organizer perspective. So there is a tension in our audiences here about to what extent are we just, describing the movements, and what extent are we making an argument for something else. And so there, in terms of how to use the book, we do hope it would have a broader audience than just teaching. But so that leads to maybe what I might want to push on back to all of you now is a couple of you raised this question of how these different strategy models connect. We have such a great cross range of people on this call. So I'm thinking maybe I can ask you all more to share your thoughts on how that might work. How did our argument come across clearly that we want the strategies to, intersect and work together? If not, how to draw on that more sharply? And yeah, maybe just digging into your point, Deepak, about sharpening that lens about it's not just that anything goes at any time. So that kind of back up open to everyone. Unless Deepak, did you want to add to the point about our audience? Or
no, I mean, I think just to maybe bring some of the stuff that came in the last conversation we had that were very relevant to what you all raised. One point was some people wanted us to be more prescriptive than we are in the book. Like, let's stop doing this in the movement and let's do more of this in the movement. So curious if people have views about that at any point during the conversation, which goes to the tension that Stephanie raised. And then on the question of how the models relate, this idea that there may be certain conditions in which certain models or combinations, certain historical conditions, certain conjunctural conditions, Kyle's point about authoritarianism, where certain things are required and other things should recede, and could we play that out more? What would that mean, either in our current circumstance or more broadly? So just throwing that into the hopper, but people should go where they want to with that.
Yeah, so floor's open for any.
I'll jump. Yeah, no, that's great. I'll jump in and get things. One of the things that I'm really interested in is this idea around. So we talked about kind of the authoritarianism conversation, like how the need to be like more prescriptive on a set of like shared values, so that you don't end up in situations where we undermine the larger political project. And, kind of like how neoliberalism kind of came to the consensus that it came to. And, sideline was civil rights and racial justice and gender justice, all these pieces. And I think like as folks who are in this work constantly know and understand, that's one thing about the larger political project. But once you start to like develop that outside, like and organize that with folks who aren't traditionally involved, like how do you keep that analysis going? And that's just a much harder conversation, because on one end you don't want to have just like this thing you were talking about, like letting 1,000 flowers bloom, but you also you gotta like be open space for both the accountability and then also inviting people in, and that's really hard without like really leaning in on a set of values as well. So I'm just interested in how folks are thinking about that as well, of like, no, there are some ways like maybe we don't we don't engage, but doing that in a way that's inviting still.
I am surprised that I feel strongly about the fact that, first of all, I do think that you are prescriptive in some ways, and it's just so even-handed and so elegantly done that I think people might miss it, that there are many moments in the book where you agitate the movement to question some of its most dearly held and poorly examined assumptions about how we do things. So I do think the book is prescriptive, and my sense is that the need that this book is trying to meet and the intervention it's trying to make is first and foremost to lay out the set of choices that organizers do have, rather than coming down on one choice over another in a non-contextual way. So I feel like to the first question about being more prescriptive, I get that. I mean, I'm partisan to many of these things too. I have tons of opinions, but I just feel like the intervention the book is trying to make is to give people a comprehensive, explicit menu of options that most of us never got. So I would want to stick up hard for that. And then to the second question about how to combine and recombine those choices, I think that would be really valuable. And maybe that could be in the toolkit or an appendix, or like different examples of like how people mash up the lineages, and what it looks like to make wise choices about that versus unwise choices. Seems like practicing what the book is actually teaching. That's my thought.
And to add on that, I think it's also thinking about like what are the capacities and skills that are needed to have discernment around when to use narrative strategy or when to use some of the other strategies that are mentioned in the book. So do you have you built the necessary skills or a culture of learning within you and the people that you're organizing with, so that you know when to deploy or mash up, etc. And I think like an example or thinking more deeply about that would be really helpful for people. Yeah.
I had a really similar reaction to Lissy's when you said the thing about people calling for some more prescriptiveness. I feel the same way as what Lissy said there. And the one thought that occurs, and I was just trying to scroll through the outline here and see if I could jog my memory from the last few days of finishing the book, but in the sort of strengths and weaknesses at the end of each of the the core chapters about the models, in there, and then throughout the chapters there's various ways in which as Lissy was saying and others, you're kind of pointing out strengths and weaknesses, even though at some points you're not necessarily calling it that, or you're pointing out examples when somebody thought they were doing this thing but it wasn't actually amounting to anything. But I think, and you, Deepak, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there isn't a consistent kind of structured thing at the end of each of those 7-8 chapters where it's kind of, okay, the way to think about this, as with all the ones, is kind of, are you, when it's working, the conditions are right for this approach and the execution is right for this approach, there's sort of fundamental bottom line, are you building actual real power, and are you exercising that power effectively? And is there some way to build in across the end of each of those chapters some piece around, okay, here's how to know it's working, here's how to know whether you chose the right approach, and here's how to know whether you executed it. Is there some common 1 or 2 or 3 questions to just pose? And then, you know, obviously the more elaborate version of that would be to go in and try to pull out some of what you've already said in there to say, so for example, with collective care, here's the way that you would know that you were doing that thing, but it actually wasn't building or exercising any power. So, you know, maybe you need to kind of think about it.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Yeah, we've already also, what's come up in previous sessions is, and some of your comments too, is that the chapters definitely are not even. And in fact, some are trying to present real wins, and some of these are much more murky. And particularly the electoral chapter, we really struggled to find a very successful example of left governance. You know, we had written the Occupy one a bit more muted, but the student debt one maybe suggests there's more victory there than we had ended it with in July. So there is some unevenness, which made the structure for each of the chapters a bit uneven. But I think that's a helpful way to think about it, common questions or criteria. Deepak, do you want to move? Yeah.
Well, maybe just one other thing on this topic. I mean, one other option to tie a few of the comments together is, you know, we do try to talk about how practitioners in different models actually rely on practitioners in other models, even when they don't think they have anything to do with them or they're opposed to them, but they depend on them. One thing we could do is to talk about authoritarianism, fascism in the conclusion, and say, okay, if we're moving past racial neoliberalism into something else, right, we're kind of in a new conjuncture, which is not an uncontroversial point, but assuming we are, then what in that circumstance, how would you use the models in the book? What rises to the top? How would they work together? That might be a place to potentially, what are the tensions, to Kyle's point about within the United Front and the coalition and values and vision? And so that's an option. I don't know how that lands with people, and more broadly, whether the kind of authoritarianism, fascism, you know, needs to have a stronger kind of footprint in the book, given where we are and when the book will come out.
I think that would be really helpful, and I'm curious what others think though. And I think that brings me back to some of what I felt like could round out some of what's in the conjunctural analysis tool, which is that I imagine part of the reason people are advocating for that being in the book is that one of the features of our conjuncture is that our political system itself is not working. And so it's not just a question of who are the forces that currently control our government and what powers do they have, but how are the political parties functioning? How is government functioning? And then, of course, how does the public perceive how the political system is functioning? Since one of the features of like fascism would be that there's actually energy in a base of people. There's just like some piece there around like, where do people have energy right now? And what do they want to do with that energy? That I think just the fact that people are asking for that, I think points to some things that could be integrated into the conjunctural analysis tool. So that then when you actually talk about the conjuncture we're in now, it's an illustration of the tool itself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this ties into your points, Greg, about Gramsci and the conjuncture or not, or if you were going in a different direction about Gramsci.
Sure. I think the part I was wrestling with there is, and I haven't been in school in a long time, so perhaps the understandings of this have advanced differently, but you know, just often Gramsci feels like it's used in the way that I understood you guys to use it around kind of narrative and hegemony. And so thinking particularly about this kind of question of culture and how critical it is to contest in the cultural sphere and at the narrative level. So obviously, yes, that's a huge deal. But I always have felt like there's this other piece that has been so formative for us in Minnesota as we've thought about our path to power, that is more kind of putting a focus on this question of kind of war of position versus war of maneuver. And to me, the fundamental insight there is around like thinking about, as you're winning hegemony, it's not like society as a whole has one cultural framework. Each of these different major institutions, you know, he was talking about the church, he was talking about unions, he was talking about cultural organizations within Italy, and with, you know, the education system, right? So he's thinking about these major building blocks of society and how you are moving a coordinated set of ideas and actual institutional organizational structures. That's the part I just want to emphasize. It's not just the narrative piece, it's a bunch of organizational structures that are also basically saturating and infiltrating those institutions from the inside. So whether that's, you know, Montessori coming out of the educational system, where there's a whole framework that is trying to take over the education system with a Marxist framework in the church and liberation theology, you know, just like there is an autonomous organizational thrust in each of those sectors. So to me, that's really helpful, because I think it's one of the things that we're profoundly splintered on in the US, is that like people have their own little jams, and I'm talking to the folks in the union world or in the C3 world, but we are not thinking about who is moving within the court system, who is moving within the education system, who is moving within, right? There's I think that framework forces you to think about who are the potential allies in the cooperative movement that we can, anyway, and then you start to coordinate, you know, you guys, I think, reference it a little bit with this idea of movement hubs, but I just feel like there's this real siloing that we're constantly battling. And that to me is one of the things that Gramsci just blows open, is no, you need to be in conspiracy with folks in these very different institutions, all rolling forward. And so there's a narrative element to that, but it's also just straight institutional. So anyway, it just felt like that piece was a little bit more lightly touched, and I felt like it would help your overall argument about like, we can't afford to be stuck in our narrow lineages. We can't afford to be stuck in our narrow traditions. We have to branch out if we're going to be successful and apply these different tools in a new moment.
That's great. And Greg, does that also speak to the question of movement interventions that you'd raised earlier? Is that where you were going with that, or was it a different point?
Yeah, connected. I mean, I saw this book as like in the labor notes world, for those of you who have a foot in that, you know, it's like the toolkit for organizers, right? Trying to take little different pieces. And it's not, you know, again, there's a million ways to organize power in this world, but tapping into these very specific US traditions and trying to lay them out so that people can see across them rather than constantly be stuck only within one. And I think that's great. I agree. It felt like there's a lot of tools about the specific subtools, but is there some kind of a template that you could really use at the end I was kind of envisioning a graph that sort of had the strengths and weaknesses of each of those models that people as an organizer could sort of take and apply in their own context. Anyway, just I guess I would push it to a simplification, like really, you know, labor notes in the organizer's toolkit really just dumbs it down and simplifies it. And I think that's actually, you know, you want the book to be nuanced and deep and profound, but then you want some tools that are super simple and easy to interface without having to read the whole book. And I would even say, is there a moment, I mean, all the great people you interviewed in this, is there a moment to pull all of us together? And is it the bringing together of all the folks in that book that actually becomes the biggest part of the intervention?
You mean literally like a large Zoom strategy meeting or something?
Sure. I mean, I was just, you know, Doran's talking, CTU folks, you know, I mean, just like, right. I mean, there was just a lot of badass people. We're all kind of peers. We have little like sub silos, and some of us know each other better.
Yeah.
But, you know, to actually be in a space where we were challenged to externalize our particular lineage and name it, and then name its weaknesses, and then understand where we could be learning from the other lineages, you know, that would be important just at a movement level, even beyond.
Love it.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And partly we had not finished the conclusion in a way. I think one vision was getting all of you in these Zoom sessions, giving insight and feedback, helping us shape what we are actually what we are concluding from this book. So we saw that in part as a collective enterprise. Let's see. Well, I guess maybe still on the point about the conjuncture and rising authoritarianism, I'm jumping a little bit here, but I hope that's okay, Deepak, but it raises a couple questions. One is going back to Kevin's point about the opposition's tactics and strategies, and do we just replicate those? Clearly, in this case, we don't, like we don't replicate fascist tactics, but when is it appropriate to learn from the opposition or not? And then it also touches a lot on the question of violence, whether it's the lineages of violence, but also the lineages of self-defense as it relates to the question of violence, non-violence. So I'm not sure if any of you have thoughts on one of those. Kevin, maybe you could say more about your comment about opposition tactics.
Yeah, I thought the learning from the enemy chapter was really strong. I'm not sure that I don't think of everyone in there as like the enemy. So I was thinking about a way to like ruffle the like various degrees of enemy in that chapter. But I felt like throughout the book, there are some moments where there are references to like the Koch brothers network in particular, or to Alec, I think once or twice, where I feel like there's a way to read those references that are really helpful as like data points out there. And kind of in this conversation about like the scale of what we're organizing, like thinking about how the right-wing infrastructure relates to like various players and institutions within it, like that relationship is the interesting reference point. I think the way it's spread out across the chapters can make it feel a little bit like if we only had this, then we'd be more successful, like the various pieces, rather than the web of relationships, which I think is like, you know, kind of the things that Alex Hertel Fernandez draws out of the book that feel most instructive for me.
I'll jump in here. This is, I have to say, this is just like the fascinating nature of this conversation is as a testament to, I think, Greg's point about how beneficial it might be to actually get a bunch of these people in the room and together just as like a byproduct of this project. I mean, I have a bunch of like editorial suggestions that I'll send to you in writing that I think maybe are just sort of not really that useful for this particular discussion. But Greg's point, I mean, about Gramsci just got me thinking about, you know, what I was kind of wrestling with as I read through the whole thing. I think the middle, you know, part two, I think is just excellent. And the way that it, you know, the strengths and weaknesses point is, you know, like the concluding note on that is excellent. But in part one, I was kind of waiting for like, why is this, what, like, why do these all, like you say that they all are necessary, but like I need to be convinced of that a little bit more. And I see the virtues of each independently in part two, but you know, the sort of like, are they all necessary? Like, do they all, you know, like that kind of, I think could be sharpened a little bit in part one. And there, I'm thinking of it as Greg speaking about Gramsci, because it's sort of another way of sort of posing it, at least for me, is it's like, how do we develop a cohesive movement strategy in the absence of a party? You know, like uniform discipline across a variety of things that we're doing, and we don't have that, and we're not, and you're not advocating for that necessarily. And so, and that's a different book, of course. So I think this is a question that is, I think still needs to be kind of like ironed out in the first part. And I think the two sort of like examples of abolitionism and like the right-wing movement for racial neoliberalism all have all 7 of these pieces and all illustrate them in different conjunctures, you know, with very different objectives. And I think that those might lend themselves to like showing somewhat systematically the virtues of all 7 in particular conjunctures towards different ends. And I think, we don't know, we think maybe we are headed towards fascism, maybe we're not, maybe whatever, right? That's a debatable point. What the conjuncture is, whether we're in a transitional period or not, these are all like open questions. And I think presuming conjuncture is impossible. The utility of something like this, I think, is helping us think through and be reflective about the historical moment that we're in, and draw on all of this stuff and be kind of like dynamic and alive to like the reality of historical time, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so I think showing again how a couple like classic cases more extensively. You do this. Chapter 5, I think you do it really well with abolitionism. Chapter 4 is terrific with the ruling class. And I think just like maybe a little more of that and like applying the 7 to those things would, and situating them, within their particular conjunctures would just be a productive opening, which then we move into the second part where we're going strategy by strategy. And that I actually don't really have any suggestions on. I think that's just terrific as is. And then I think in the closing, there is potentially like reflections on conjuncture, like how to think about where we're at, how to think about how change happens beyond, it's sort of classic Marx's dictum of we make history but not within conditions of our choosing, and how do we make sense of those conditions? Are they changing? Like, we can't know. I think that actually fits quite nicely in the final part on like internal movement dynamics, because this is obviously always an open question what the conjuncture is. So I don't know, those are just some reflection. I mean, I think I just think that like the whole versus some of its parts thing needs to be driven a little bit more. And it's there. It's just like, I think there's ways to do it. And I can send you more kind of specific harebrained ideas I have, which may involve more writing, but may also involve some cutting, which then like, your word count wouldn't change too much. All right, anyway.
Just if I can jump, that prompts a couple of things, and one of which is whatever, just like an amendment to my earlier thought about the sticking something into the end of each of the model chapters. But Deepak and others have said maybe there's something more conclusive or sort of summarizing or meaning making at the end, and I sort of agree with that, rather than trying to go deeper into making the model chapters more consistent. And taking it a step further, then kind of prompted a little bit by what Samir was saying, and Stephanie's point about the already kind of accepted unevenness across those chapters, that I'm sure you both have talked about this amongst yourselves already, that some of these things are models in the sense of they imagine themselves as coherent wholes of an approach, and then some people are actually acting on them. And some of these things aren't really that, right? Some of these things, I don't think there's anybody out there who thinks I'm in the electoral model and like, this is what I do and I don't do anything else and everything that everybody else is doing is wrong, right? Or the inside outside model, right? And some of these things are sort of strategies within a bigger, kind of theory of change. Some of them are tactical orientations that are kind of consciously chosen in terms of inside and outside. We need to be operating in that way. Like, they're part of the reason I imagine for those chapters to be uneven is that they are a little apple and orange in some ways. That is fine. Like, that's not a critique. I think, like, to me, it sort of reinforces this point I think that you all are making in the book, and that several people have raised now to take it even further, like Samir was just doing. I think that the intervention is let us lay out. It's a little bit of an intellectual exercise to pull these things apart for the sake of putting them in a chapter and kind of interrogating them on their own terms, even though some are models, some are strategies, some are kind of tactical orientations, if those are even the right categories. But the exercise is useful and part of your all's intervention to kind of make people who think they're of that thing or part of that or not, to understand it, interrogate it, see it on its own terms. But then really what you're saying with the whole book is, none of us, even those of you who think you are, none of us is just squarely inside of the four corners of one thing. These things all interact with each other. So it's useful to understand them. It's useful to understand the interaction of them and the complementariness, is that a word, of them? And then the conjectural, the sort of contextual relevancy points that people have made is really important. And so anyway, that just brings me back to my sort of, are you really building power? Are you really exercising it to like the effect of the change that you seek, sort of as the bottom line questions at the end, and doing that more in a integrated way at the end and in a sort of realist, real examples, whether they're historical or contemporary way, which some of which you all have already done here. That all makes a lot of sense to me, but I don't know, I'm having a little, wheels turning thing about, might there be any use, or is it too late for you all to think about the word model or the sort of the construct there, and whether to actually come out and say, these actually aren't all the same. They're kind of different dimensions, elements, tools in the box, whatever you would want to call it. Is there a way to maybe use a different construct there that would help with where you're trying to do the intervention of like, these are tools, these are methods, these are approaches, and let us understand them and let us put them together in the right way, depending on the circumstances. And then my other somewhat unrelated, although it's all related, idea that occurred when Greg was talking about Gramsci and the institutions and kind of what's the conspiracy movement wide and kind of society wide. I had one little kernel there, which was, you talk about, which many people do in the labor organizing context, of where are strategic sectors or where are strategic groups of workers given their positioning in the means of production. There's a comparable concept, I think, related to Greg's point of what is the sort of societal wide, movement wide kind of contextual analysis and power analysis and sort of strategy choices. On a movement level, there are, in certain circumstances, strategic institutions within which to contest, sectors of, or parts of the strategy that maybe need more collective emphasis. You don't use this language, but of course you make the point about the 2020 election and the kind of somewhat conscious, somewhat just whatever, disorganized collective decision to go throw a lot of what we all collectively had at the election in 2020. But I don't know, there's something there that may be beyond the scope of the book. There may be a way to kind of nod at it in your concluding points, but it occurred.
Can I follow up a little bit on this? I think Kevin made this comment, and maybe Kyle was too, about sort of strategy as a process, something that, is not, you go off in a room by yourself and come up with the whatever that happens in the context of a particular situation, movement, and that maybe that doesn't come out as much. And I'm curious if other people agree, and if there are ideas about how to bring that to life more. Like what would it mean to bring that to life?
Yeah, no, I want to elaborate on that a little bit, and then I'd love to hear what others' thoughts. I really like the point you made about how we don't do enough of that, right, in terms of that strategy piece, because it isn't, you look at within the movement, but then also like beyond just kind of the organizing, like kind of the progressive ecosystem that isn't incentivized. We see it obviously in think tanks where it's like you produce products and you move on to the next product that you produce. There isn't a whole lot of incentivizing of the importance of strategy and doing that in team and collectively. And it also helps to confront some of those internal, relationships when it comes to, relationally, overdogs, and, we know funders and philanthropy play a big role in upholding a lot of these systems that they allegedly should be pushing against, right? But like, I think, more opportunities for strategy as roles for organizations, I think would be particularly helpful, but finding different ways to incentivize that, different ways to ensure that people don't see, the toolkits as, well, that's just for organizers and, that's just for this particular lane. That's not something that applies to us. I do think there's ways to kind of connect that both through more emphasis, maybe kind of a closeout in the book itself, but then also through the way in which the toolkits are distributed might be a good way to kind of incentivize ways for people who might not see themselves as that applying to them as something that they can engage with as well.
I'll just add a little, sorry, Deepak.
No, I was going to ask you that. That was very helpful. And I was going to see if you had more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the sort of like incentivizing language, because I mean, you remind me, it's like every individual and then every organization is supposed to have their own strategy. Like that's your like fundraising purchase point. And like the idea that some people play the piano and some people carry the piano is like totally lost, right? Like everybody has to play the piano and play their own very specific tune. And so like how to disrupt, like actually elevating some ways to disrupt that. Because when I think there's a way, I mean, this was my thought going into the book is like, okay, it's a book about campaign strategy. How do I build strategies within my own organization? Actually building strategies in relationship to other strategies is like, well, that's the secret sauce of the book. And there might be a way to actually just be a little bit more explicit about it. And then tactically, I would add like the role of like the debrief. I feel like, I don't know, maybe half the campaigns I've been on have done a debrief at the end, which I always think is sort of a fascinating thing to spend like 2 years working on something and then set aside 90 minutes at the end to see what lessons we learned. And so I do think there's like a sort of a tactical, like daily or weekly practice of what did we learn? Where do we leave power on the table this week? Where do we step into our own power? Like that sort of work that I know is pretty present in some of the faith organizing traditions that has a lot of applicability for me in thinking about the like strategy as a process work.
Yeah, we one of the folks on our other call from Cali Calls was talking about how they do their power analysis tool every week, once a week, I think, or once a week, I think. So they're constantly engaging and debriefing and updating. So
Is there any more on this cluster of like conjunctures, strategizing, the models? Because there's some other stuff we want to cover, but I just want to see if there's more in this broad area.
Well, Kevin's point about sort of approaching it, thinking it was sort of a strategy for an organization and then seeing it as a strategy about relations between organizations, just I think brings up this point. And I was sort of making it earlier, and this is maybe redundant, but like it is the case that not every organizer, not every organization can be expected to do all of these things, right? And maybe they're going to do one of them. And so that like the question, we know historically and we know abstractly that, let's say, these 7 come together and produce transformative change. But what is I guess a question, and this is back to the, and I'll stop asking the party question at some point, but like, what is like the agent that coalesces this? I think that's sort of an open question. Like, how is this supposed to harmonize? Like, are we, and you do address this, throughout, and I think in the opening chapter, but I think I'm just thinking about it more, and it's still, I think you address it, but it's still a little bit unclear to me. Like, how is it all supposed to work? And in the absence of, the central committee telling us all what to do.
it all happens at CUNY. That's where it happens.
I mean, I do think, just to that point, there may be something to say explicitly about what degree of harmony or alignment we can reasonably expect, and to what degree some measure of agonism is just like part of the deal. And that we may be better off getting clear on our strategies than getting in a room with everyone who's already organized and making sure that they're cool with us doing what we're doing. But on this topic of sort of putting the broader movement into the conjunctural analysis. One of the tools that I found really useful is Bill Moyer's map tool that got a shout out in Ryan Grimm's infamous article, but basically I think has allowed me as an organizer to really assess like, where are we on this issue? And then to examine in a kind of ecosystemic assessment, like who's holding down the fort on what fronts. And I think that that's already illustrated actually in many of the case studies. Like, for example, the 351 was clearly a response to the fact that like a technocratic policy advocacy front was already being held down and it was inadequate. I mean, I feel like some of what we're trying to avoid here is saying like, yeah, some things are already being held down and it's like not enough. But like, I think a more generative way of saying that is just like, if we know that all of these lineages are on our menu of options, minimally what we can ask ourselves is which of these in our regions or our issue areas or whatever are already like, someone's really already thinking about that. And then what are some of the things that aren't? Like there's a moment in the book where you're like, disruption will probably be really important for us in the years to come. And we have a lot to learn from it. It feels like you're basically already doing this in the book somewhat and just like making it explicit how you think about the gaps. And what the existing movement is and is not yet taking responsibility for could be helpful.
I just wonder if there's any energy around the pursuing this question about how strategy comes together at a movement level. If there's anything anyone else has to say. I mean, the best we could come up with in the book really was this notion of movement hubs, which aren't maybe for the whole movement, but maybe for clusters of aligned organizations. And, you know, we named some examples of that. And that's a place where people who kind of are on the same project with some similar analysis of the conjuncture are coming together to assess in some of the ways that Lissy was talking about what's the state of our play and where do we move. It's not like the grand theory, but it's one step up from, you know, what Kyle was saying of incentivized to do our next widget, right? So that's where it lands. And I'm curious if there's more we could push towards or might push towards.
I mean, I feel so it's this tension I have in my guts here with this conversation. Are you trying to lay out a historically accurate survey of the lineages in the US in the last 50 years? Or are you trying to hold up a set of lineages that you think have something to contribute to the next phase? You know, you got a little bit of a foot in both worlds. That's not bad. But I mean, when I read it, it struck me that it was missing the explicit party building strategy. So again, is that a model? You know, it could have its own chapter in part 3 as a question of like, how do these different models come together? Are there structures needed? Movement hubs is a sort of decentralized, sectarian approach. There are, of course, centralized sectarian approaches. Anyway, whatever, you know, there's a whole, you can have, anyway, you know, there's all sorts of models you can do within there, but that idea of like folks with feet in different areas coming together and running a coherent strategy is a thing. And obviously there's long lineages in the US wrestling over different structures that have worked best. Anyway, I think often that is a little bit invisible, even though there's a whole bunch of stuff to be said on that. And I think it's helpful to surface it, because if you don't name it, then it kind of gets pushed and then it lives its way out in your 7 models.
Just to be clear, you're saying what doesn't get elevated enough is that there are actually efforts to do this kind of thing by creating strategic hubs. That's not, is that right?
Yep. And just, I think, you know, the idea of party separate from the question of electoral party, but the idea of party, whether that's Marxist understood party or, but anyway, you know, political instrument, maybe that's the term. It feels like there could be, one of the models could be political instrument.
not political, not Democrats and Republicans, meaning.
Yep. You
That's
got
separate.
you got a section on that. That's great. I mean, it's critical.
Yeah.
That needs to be in there.
Right.
But this idea, I mean, and I think you're addressing it a little bit with movement hubs. I just feel like you haven't fleshed out exactly what the movement hubs look like. When have they been functional? There are, again, very structured, systematic versions of that. That is called whatever, the Socialist Workers' Party in 1930s Minneapolis. That was a movement hub. That was a particular way of doing it. Then, you know, then we have very different ways that has gotten structured.
Mhm.
But I think anyway, my point is just more directly dealing with that would help surface it so that, yeah.
Good point. Yeah. So maybe going in a different direction, are there other places where there was just, you know, or the same direction? Are there other places that were holes, things that were missing, either cases that should have been covered or arguments that should have been mentioned? And maybe along those lines, just chapters that didn't work.
Mhm.
I think for the chapter where you're talking about 350, I think throughout the book you talk about this idea around like Black liberation and abolition. I think there's a piece you could add in there around the movement for environmental justice and how that was started, and you know, through Black liberation, particularly in the South. And I think it connects really nicely back to this idea of, you know, the overdogs really doing these strategies around divide and conquer, and that there's a place for Indigenous and Black liberation to work together, particularly through this lens of climate justice and environmental justice. And so it would be nice to think about the through line of abolition and Black liberation as it connects to, you know, either 350 or just thinking about like the climate movement as a whole.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
It also feels very, very important given the debates around where we are right now on the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the ins and outs of that conversation. Yeah. Any other chapters people like want to have a hack at?
Not quite a hack at this one, but a little bit on this one is kind of this underdog overdog piece, just like who is, like, you know, who is the underdog, because that especially, like there are a set of people, especially Black, brown, Indigenous people, who like are consistently underdogs within these movements that should be for quote unquote transformative change, that often those wins are what's sacrificed. So like, how do we even define a win in those situations? I know it comes up throughout, but it is kind of this like assumption. And then also like you have this reactionary ideology on the right that sees themselves as the underdog and the victims of grievance, right? And in some cases, like, you know, some of those folks are, right, because you've got a much more powerful set of overdogs that are driving that vision forward. So that part's a little, and I think goes to Kevin's point, or at least some of it I thought about with Kevin's point around like who the enemy is. And I know a lot of times it's situational, but that came up to me a little bit. And then specifically as it relates to the chapter, a little bit on thinking about the Children's Crusade. I think like some of it is probably just like some editorial. I made some suggestions, I'll send those later, but some of it's like editorial, but it was almost as if like it kind of was neatly wrapped up in a way, like, you know, we had the Birmingham church bombing, you know, but outside of it, like it was, you know, some of the violence against children. Like I know you were referencing mostly about Connor violence and vicious dogs and water hoses, but like it almost kind of seemed like the side note was like this larger political violence, which was not the intended, you know, happenings and response that we're talking about. That is like leads to mass death and violence, right? Which is like goes into, I think, Stephanie's point earlier around like this question of violence and question of self-defense. And like you talk about it a little bit when you talk about like handling backlash, like and the violence that it connects to that. So that to me was a little bit like, I think some editorial it could be cleaned up a little bit so it's not as, I think, maybe insensitive on some of these areas.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comment. And I actually think you're right that it's editorial, but I think it goes beyond editorial. And I would welcome any, we have gone in a circle around the violence question, you know, many aspects of it, whether there needs to be something in the book that talks about, since many of us kind of came up in a period of, I mean, there's plenty of violence in American history. There's plenty of violence right now against oppressed groups. But the post 65 to now period is different qualitatively than previously. And if we're going back to something, does there need to be more about how do you contend with a period of much more political violence? That's one question. Another question is like, the truth of, you know, abolition is the Haitian Revolution was a key part of it, right? So what are we really saying about the role of violence here? Anyway, it's like a tangle, which we kind of duck. So would welcome any thoughts about it. Maybe it doesn't feel that important. I mean, I'm not sure.
Oh no, I think it is. No, I think it is. I mean, I think I'm curious what others think, because that is something that I notice is like how obviously like how you kind of avoid some of that, but it is such kind of a central element of obviously our history, and then also to come in future periods of potential, you know, political violence, especially as you push for transformative change, and backlash is inevitable in many ways. But yeah, I'd be interested in other thoughts on that as well.
I also thought, I mean, I thought it was, even though it's a tangle, I appreciated the choices that you made about it. And I guess one thought I had is that I really appreciate abolition as a case study through line in the book. And that one of the benefits of borrowing international examples from that movement is that it's clear that civil war was not the only way to abolish slavery, because you use other contexts as an example. And at the same time, why the Civil War was necessary in the US is sort of elided, or like, I just think actually a lot of organizers today don't want a civil war, and it's not clear what conditions, not that you would need to answer the question of like, to the degree that war is itself like part of the broader violence conversation. I just thought that, and to some extent, I think this is also treated in a different way, actually in the inverse, kind of with like the radical flank stuff around the decolonization movements in the context of the civil rights movement. And that to some extent, what's being illuminated here is that part of the conjuncture is the international movement and the international left, and how what's happening here is always in relationship with what's happening elsewhere. But yeah, I don't think I want to advocate for like a really explicit statement of like, these are the conditions under which violence is necessary. So the fact that that's left out doesn't feel like a problem to me. I just feel myself circling it as I'm thinking out loud. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I think where we landed was obviously kind of bracketing violence and bracketing internationalism, because they felt like whole new books. But yeah, it's both really challenging.
I guess I'll just add on that. I mean, it does seem like a part of the tangle is maybe the distinction between like what you call transformative change and revolution. You know, and maybe, you know, I don't know of an example of a revolution, including the Civil War, I would say, that doesn't involve violence. But is it possible? I mean, I don't see, at a certain point we're getting academic about this, and like I think I think you handle it. This is all to say, I think you handle it well. I think like, look, we can't win violently. So there's no point in really going there, is about as much as you need to do. But I do think it's an interesting question to discuss. I mean, I agree though, like, I don't know, like, I'm not sure that it's, yeah, I'll stop there too, because this could go on.
Mirroring Stephanie, Olivia, and my conversations, what just happened in the last few minutes, pretty much. Does anyone want to weigh in on Kyle's thing about underdogs and overdogs, either to defend it or further question it, or an alternative to it? I think it's pretty obvious why we did it. But yeah, I'm just curious if anyone else has any other. We can definitely do more to define it. That for sure came from a lot of the comments, but.
Could if you want to take time here on this for a sec, like Kyle, could you say another couple sentences about what would you do?
Well, I wish I knew. No, I mean, it's more so just like, it is like the assumption that, like, it kind of comes across as like the assumption, like a very clean cut of it, like glossy overviews, like the overdogs are like this like right wing kind of those in power who are, you know, have used this power for the last 40, 50 years, and then obviously through society to kind of implement their traditional hierarchy vision on society, right? And like what underdogs need are these sorts of strategies: organized people power, discipline, creative effort, all these things to basically overcome these overdogs. But to me, that like it somewhat misses a little bit of the analogy, and I know this is kind of hard to like do, but like relatively speaking, you talk about power, but like there are underdogs and overdogs on the right, like that are, and I think in our tradition, we like rooting for the underdog, right, is like kind of the tradition that we're in. But then when you look at like within our broader, like within our movement's ecosystem, like who are the overdogs and the underdogs within our movement, right? And how does that operate, and how to use strategies within our movement to create the types of changes that we need, not vis-a-vis the right wing authoritarianism. And then I think that gets less play. You know, you talk about it a little bit, it gets less play, but I still think is particularly useful for creating the type of, you know, change we want to see, or underdogs want to see.
Yeah, I mean, we don't just stick with it. The other option that was kind of obvious to use was oppressed and oppressor. It just feels very, I don't know, like, is that really the essence of people, you know, as opposed to them being in struggle? Like, I don't love what that holds exactly. And, you know, it's different in
Yeah,
other,
I agree. Yeah.
if you're referring to specific groups, a lot easier. Workers, Black liberation, you know, then it doesn't have this kind of connotation. But anyway, so.
Another term that some people raise questions about, some people really liked, some people didn't so much, was racial neoliberalism. And so we just thought we'd check to see if there's reactions to that. Oh, I see, many versus the few. Yeah, we could. Well, the other term was 99% versus 1%, but yeah, we struggle with all the terms. So.
I think real quick, I think the term itself is fine. Like, I think it's just the defining it that maybe just a little, just more into the defining it. And I think some of that is helpful in like the power relations. Like these are not fixed terms necessarily, but like maybe whether it's historically or traditionally, you know, I think that's helpful, but the term itself is fine. I agree. I think oppressor versus oppressed is a little too rigid for this.
So racial neoliberalism sounds okay. Just while we're in the zone, just to give people a sense around racial neoliberalism, some people said, there's a thing called racial capitalism, and then there's neoliberalism, and you're like doing this racial neoliberalism thing, which is not a common phrase. What we're trying to do is to say that obviously that in this conjuncture, the two systems have been intertwined in a fundamental way in the construction. So that's the idea. But yeah, just curious if anyone has any objection to it.
I like the way in which I take your meaning also, that neoliberalism kind of more explicitly encompasses the sort of hegemony and consciousness dimensions of the thing, which obviously whatever, lots of us bake that into capitalism when we use that word too, but I think it's useful in the context of the book.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm partial to it, so I think I like it.
I figured you would. I figured you would be a fan of it. Yes.
Yeah, Felicia and I are fans. Yeah, we like it.
You've written the paper about it. Maybe while we're in this zone, one other thing, the formula. So there's formulas throughout the book about the strategies, and then there's an opening formula, which is like strategy, people power, luck. I can't imagine, the different things. Generally, people have responded pretty positively to the specific formulas, but there's been a lot of mixed views about that overall formula. And does that actually confuse from the thesis, or is it helpful? Curious if people have any view about that.
I sort of bumped on luck when I was reading that part and made a note to myself to come back and think about it, and then I never did. I know what you mean, and I'm partly bumping on the concept of it, but maybe more so just on the word. Like, do you want to tie that to the sort of context or circumstances, or sort of, do you actually want to come out and say the conjunctural analysis there, which you probably don't want to do in the formula, but like just context or circumstances, maybe. Like luck feels flippant, or kind of, like there's no agency in that part of the formula, which I don't think is what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
Though there is, I think there isn't a component that has no agency, like an actual battle might even depend on the weather or whatever, so there is that small element that, or whatever, like the right wing has a grave misstep. So I think we were trying to capture a little bit of that, but I hear you when it sounds flippant and it seems like, oh, well, like, let's just roll the dice and see what happens.
I think that maybe too academic substitute, but one that I'm partial to as a historian is contingency. I think that, gets at what you're trying to say and avoids some of what Deepak's raising.
I do like luck only because this is a still pretty academic kind of book, and luck is like, I don't know. So I'm fine with the formula. I think as far as like a formula that you kind of go back to, it doesn't really seem like, it's like you kind of open it with it and then you get into the other strategies. So it's not really something that's like, oh, people, their takeaway is going to be that formula. Like, I don't see that being a thing, but it is something that, I do find it, the explanation, right, is pretty interesting, right? Like, as you put it out there and you describe what each of the elements are, like that in of itself, is like a piece folks can kind of take away and like think about. So I found that interesting as well, but I agree that it more has to do with context and conditions as well.
So can I go more into a couple of conceptual? Oh, courage, that's a good one. Yeah, a couple more conceptual issues. So one, what do people think about the way we treated power in the book? This was like one of the biggest wrestles because there's 50 million academic and other ways of talking about power. So there's 6 forms of power. Curious about any responses to whether that seems right. And then how we dealt with vision. in the book has come up a few times. So courage breaks heart. How we dealt with vision, like, is it too kind of, does it have too much of a utopian feel in the sense of, like, you know, several people have raised, like, it's not as helpful in the context of struggle as we portray it in the book, to have the grand vision of the destination of where we're going to, and so those two questions, power and vision, just any comments, thoughts about either of those?
Deepak, could you repeat the question about power?
Is it like the right useful framework to be talking about power? Like, we could teach about power, the different levels of power, you know, which is the Healy Hinson version. We could talk about, there's like 10 different ways of doing it. We chose this particular one: forms of, ideological, disruptive, political, military, solidarity, and I always forget one. I don't know which one it was. Economic. Those 6. And then argue that overdogs tend to use some more, or underdogs tend to use others more, but they're both available, at least in theory, to uneven extents to both underdogs and overdogs. And then, I mean, it's, yeah, so curious how that.
Yeah, we had like 5 versions of these chapters. So just hope to hear if they were useful, or you've seen other frameworks that are more useful.
I absolutely love it. I can feel the hard choices that you all had to make in doing it. And I was like, I saw the nod to the Eric Olin Wright framework at the end, and the Ark and Fung one. And yeah, so just want to say, what you did looks really easy when we get to receive the final version of it, and then I just know that it wasn't. So thank you. I think the 2 things that came to mind for me around the framework were, one, that I was a little, I think that since a lot of people think there's like a crisis of base building right now, on the one hand, the solidarity power is the most obvious one, because anyone who's already reading the book already thinks it matters. And on the other hand, wondered if there's just more to say there about how to build it and do it. And whether that actually intersects meaningfully with some of what is in Eric Olin Wright's framework around associational. I mean, this is built into your conjuncture stuff too, how you think about solidarity, but just like the actual process of building unity. Is it about identifying what people want but can't get on their own? Is it like, this is just like the bread and butter of organizing in some way that I thought could be elaborated a little bit more. I'll stop there.
Yeah, one thought that's maybe related to where Lissy was going right there, that I always have in this conversation about power and how to categorize or sort of make a scheme of describing, is there's the kind of basis of the form of the actual raw power is kind of one side of the question. And then there's the manifestation of it, the mode of exercising it, or the arena within which we exercise it. And a lot of the frameworks, I think this one too, mixes those. And it's sometimes in the mixing and the fudging of those that the thing happens that Lissy's describing, I think, which is the sort of the first side is a big part of where we're all collectively lacking and have been for so long, of like, we can talk about whether we want to go be powerful politically, or whether we want to go be powerful through a boycott, or whether we want to go through powerful through, you know, disruption. of economic enterprise, but like if there isn't any scale and depth of actual power of the people organized or whatever the other form, the raw form of the thing is, then, you know, obviously that affects what you can do. And so I can't remember in the beginning of this chapter, maybe you all said something that was sort of conceptually in this ballpark that I'm nodding at right now. I can't remember, but that's the one thing that always I think occurs to me about how to increase the richness and the sort of understanding from any, you know, I wouldn't have any opinion about, oh, you should do the 3 things, not the 6 things. Like that matters less to me than being clear about this point and then just describing the things meaningfully with real life examples, which I think you do well.
Mhm.
Kevin, did you want to go?
I was going to talk about vision. So if we want to stay more here
One more-
strictly
one
on
more
power
question.
for a minute.
Yeah, one more question on the power piece. So on this whole kind of conversation about the crisis of base building, so maybe this argues for just emphasizing more clearly that I think we say it many times, maybe just more clearly in this context, that without the mass organized base, nothing else really matters from our point of view. It also relates a little bit to I think Dominique's point about sort of getting beyond the choir potentially inside particular movements, but sort of more broadly, like that is something I think we could say, you know, more directly, explicitly, like there's no way around that. There are all kinds of questions it raises about how to do with principle, how to not do it in a way that dilutes certain key, you know, but that is key. So yeah, okay, that's very helpful. Kevin, take it away. I think we can go to vision.
Yeah, this is probably just me. So the group might vote me down here, but I feel like the placement of I really like the value stuff. Let me start with the part, like talking about the grounded values, I think is really helpful. I think the placement of the vision chapter, yeah, like I need a lot of encouragement. Great. But the placement of the vision chapter for me sort of like plays the same movement song about like the most important thing that we can do is like figure out where we want to be together in 30 years, which just like it doesn't ring true to me. And I feel like there's been a decent amount of emphasis in the past, I don't know, decade or so on some of these vision questions. Like for me, the strength and the utility of the book is in the questions of like, how do we get there and what's been missing? Like, you know, as we've like, the vision has grown a little bit, but in some ways that vision of like the world as it should be is like, you know, we've continued to add on to it. I don't know how much closer we've moved. And the book for me is about how do we move closer? And so I think grounding in values makes sense. I think I got a little distracted by some of the grounding in vision because it feels distant to me from some of the other pieces of the work. That was like a 2 on my cranky scale.
I was hoping you'd bring a little bit. I think you might need to add a little more gasoline to the fire if you want to generate any heat, you know?
Yeah, right. You can ramp up. All of you can ramp up on the critiques. We're happy. We can take it. But I'm curious if other people have reactions to that. How you felt if the vision stuff feels too abstract, or is it helpful?
Well, and to Kevin's point, I mean, I think part of it is it's a reaction to a certain strain in our world that's like overly pragmatist about, you know, what's right in front of us. And that still exists, but it exists a lot less than it existed 10 years ago, I would say. So maybe it's an overcorrection. And, you know, I think, Kevin, it would actually be helpful for you to say what you said about like when you've had conversations in the housing context, what its utility, and you know, because I think that to me was a compelling point.
Oh yeah, just to add that like I feel like some of the vision conversations, like especially in the tenant organizing work that I've been involved in, like talking about where we want to be, like social housing or like some of the visionary policies feels so distant from day-to-day lived reality, that talking about the vision is almost a distraction for people. Well, yeah, it's like, that's great. Well, social housing, like, you know, my landlord like raised my rent $400 today, and there are roaches in my apartment. Like, the gap between like what we need to do this week, this month, this year in our organizing challenges and the long-term vision is like, actually, in some of our work has made it seem like we're not in touch with how dire and how urgent the organizing needs are.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, sometimes in teaching, when we try and talk about either non-reformist reforms or Powell memo or things like that, and sometimes students really struggle, like when they're like, a non-reformist reform might be childcare tax credit, you know, and we're like, or I mean, that's fine, but like, they don't go first to like free childcare for all, right? Like they don't even go there because it's so far. But I think then for other people, it's like when they do get to like think, and like they go the other way around, like they start with this big vision of how things should be different, and then they get more interested in the organizing. So I don't know if it's just an individual thing that people come to it differently, because I feel like we've had strong reactions both ways. I really was the one pushed hard for this vision chapter because I think I've seen some people really light up and get much more interested in the project, or, you know, like in organizing once they talk about vision. But I completely hear what you're saying. For a lot of people, it's just way too abstract.
To me, thinking about the interventions needed on the question of vision, so I agree there is a block of the movement where we're hyper pragmatic, and so just the assertion of the need for a long-term vision is super helpful, but that's definitely not everybody. And I agree that used to be like a lot, and now it's like definitely a smaller tendency than most. I would say there's a separate kind of opposite tendency that is also in my mind needs an intervention, which is a lot of organizations imagine that a small number of staff are the ones that need to do a deep visioning process and go to the great ends of the earth with great amounts of time to synthesize their vision of where things need to go, as opposed to really wrestling with the question of who is doing the visioning, and that needs to be in a base building organization. That needs to be the base. Anyway, because those are very different processes. A very small, cadre-esque group of staff versus a more open, accessible process that connects the where the rats are at in the buildings with a bigger vision and have people participate. Anyway, so when I think in the Twin Cities we've sometimes done the real cadre version, and that's been fine and helped a small group of people get some clarity, but we're always pushing ourselves not to confuse that with a very different process, which is a large base going through a process to create a vision, because those are just very different processes.
Now that's the Kevin I know and love. That's what I was waiting for this whole call. There we go, finally.
I made a very short, not fully formed comment about this on the manuscript, but just where Greg was going and what Stephanie was saying, I guess where I go here is agreeing with what you said about, the sort of current realities in the movement compared to 10 years ago. To me, the real challenge and thing that we all collectively mostly don't do well is how do you actually act now in a way that is sort of integrative of, we have an actual long-term vision that's clear and that's compelling, that's based on our values. We have a power analysis that is realistic, and therefore we have a notion of how far we are from that and what the possible power building path to get there is. And we understand the world as it is today. We understand our power as it is today. And so therefore we are fighting for these things right now, which we understand to be incremental. We understand to be partial, but we have some way as a part of the visioning process and the strategy process with, yes, members and leaders and staff, of understanding the connection and the interaction between those things explicitly as a part of strategy. Yes, I have a power analysis, so I know we're far from that. Here's what we have to do now, but I am building power on the way. I have some notion that this thing I'm fighting for today is actually moving in that direction, as opposed to unintentionally moving me in a wrong direction because I didn't stop to think about it for a second about, is there a relationship? Is this taking me on a path that's either pointed in that direction or not? And also, I mean, this is one of the things I shared on the manuscript is from the old scope stuff from GASP 20 years ago. That was part of the tools that we at the scope crew and actually the GPP crew built this kind of training and strategy kind of process with a set of local groups. One of the small dimensions of which was in this zone of how do we build this muscle and how do we explicitly have this strategy conversation, not just in the 35,000 foot visioning part of our process, but in the what are we doing right now? What's the connection between those things? Is it pointed in the same path? And then secondly, is the way we're campaigning, is the way we're organizing and doing outreach to new people, is the way that we are articulating our analysis of here's the real problem, here's the actual real root cause of that problem, here's our vision solution, here's our first step right now thing, and how we campaign about that, what the narrative is about that. Is that way of doing stuff also pointing us in that direction? And are we making sure to avoid the short-term problem of we're going to live inside the current ideology and hegemony, and we're going to play into like, sorry, Deepak, like, well, let's, these are the good immigrants. And so let's campaign for the good immigrants today. And we'll play into that. People think that there's some good ones and some bad ones. And tactically in the short term, that might help us win something right now. So let's go win something by feeding into that thing, even though that actually sets us back in the long term, right, on the ideological front. And so we had a tool 20 years ago for sort of having that kind of conversation in the real intersection of vision and long-term strategy with campaigning today. And that also may be beyond the scope. But anyway, that's what occurs to me was sort of when Kevin's raising this point and folks are talking about the two ends of the spectrum. To me, the real magic is being able to have those two parts of that conversation kind of in the same space with the same people and kind of make some choices.
That's really helpful. I think that's really actionable too. How does the vision live in the actual day-to-day work? I think that's super, as opposed to an exercise we do off to the side. So speaking about sending staff to the ends of the earth, we have a chapter on internal movement conflict, which I'd love to hear if there are any reflections about. And Dominique, we would like the principled struggle tool that you referenced. We'd love if you would send that along to us. But yeah. So just love to hear if there's any thoughts about internal movement conflict and how we handled it. Or as a bonus round, I can ask a different question, which is, maybe while folks think about that, which is there were a few questions about conflicts between different models. So one example is like disruptive organizing, backlash, confronting, electoral politics. I think a couple of people have raised the defund, the way they got weaponized politically by mainstream Democrats, that kind of thing. Does that need more treatment, either the case of disruptive politics and disruptive movement and electoral politics, or any other particular conflicts that need more treatment?
I think so. I think I had put a note in about disruptive and electoral power, but would just add like the way disruptive power works. Like, I think it's maybe the piece here that has the potential to disrupt like the other strategies or tactics that are working in this book. Like it can disrupt the underdogs as well as the overdogs, and it might be worth playing that out a little bit more.
Do you mean disruptive strategy by underdogs undermining other underdogs, or do you mean disruptive?
Yeah, if we do this disruption, it's going to ruin the media narrative. It's going to prevent our coalition building. It shows up obviously most clearly in electoral circles, but not exclusively.
And what would illuminate that for you? Like a case or some principles of how to deal with it, or?
I was hoping someone else would have a really good idea of how to deal with the problem that I raised. Thought that was kind of the partnership thing that we had. I do. Yeah, I was struggling to actually come up with a case study that ties it up neatly. Which is maybe not the point of this one, but I do feel like if it's not a full-blown case study, maybe a couple of examples of how groups and coalitions have wrestled with this, which I do think actually goes to the bigger question of the book of like, what are those spaces where people who hold different strategies are in sort of deep and consistent relationship with each other, where you're like playing that out, which is maybe the conclusion, or maybe adding into the section specifically about disruptive power.
Right, because while these can go together well, they can also fail to cohere, and they can cancel each other out.
Yeah, and I think some of that is helpful in terms of thinking about how not backlash impacts this, right? Kind of the cause and effect, not just the backlash as you imagine from those who are clear political opponents, but the backlash among the movement itself. And you handle it like there are points where you touch on it throughout, but I do think like kind of getting a little neater specifically under the disruption section might be helpful too, as well as playing it out in the different toolkits. Like, okay, how does, we've got the big model chart, which is fantastic, by the way, getting the big model, but then thinking about, okay, what does this disruptive model look like comparatively to electoral, this is how we see it playing out with electoral context. And I think that's a really useful exercise as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think I personally had in some cases hesitated to call out bad examples just because, like there's maybe I don't know all the information, or we don't, like one example might be that the Wisconsin upsurge protests was disruption that got channeled into electoral work, which to me seemed like a mistake. It seemed like it should have been channeled into base building work. But it's like, do we actually want to reopen and litigate, some of these past examples? Do they illuminate, or do they just create, space for debate and dissension? It's a little unclear to me, like how much to balance that.
Yeah, we don't really scold people a whole lot in the book. There's one or two examples of it, but we don't really do that. And yeah, I'm not sure we're predisposed to.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It seems like a choice. I appreciate the choice. It did feel like the only thing that means is missing is there are historical reasons why each one of these lineages have their weaknesses and strengths. It's because they develop out of a set of historical circumstances that kind of limited what they are. And then they're, so for example, in the labor version, SPFE's transformation and becoming a base building labor union is a reaction and a resistance to a form of labor organization, that was structurally built in our society very intentionally for a long time. And so SPFE is a rejection of that and a going in a different direction. Anyway, so I just kind of felt like you guys chose not to go down that path, because I think one of those paths, there's that history of how each of these things emerged and what they were resisting against in each of the 7 models. I sort of got the sense that you made a choice not to really go in and name that. So there's a little bit lost there, because there is some like nuance about what are the natural limits of this model, what was it made trying to address, what therefore is it blind to, that could be helpful, but it also would mean that you would need to just add way more on terms of like defending the position of why what SPFE's critique was of the labor movement and why it got to where it went.
That's also where I think like the conjecture stuff is so important, because like in all throughout this, and many times you're also like, yeah, in many ways they broke the norms and rules of these models and got to achieving, right? So I do think that part is also just like help, and that's also another helpful way to tie back to that initial formula, to tie back to kind of the chords of change elements to it, of like, you know, there are all the, you know, organized people power, you know, the context situation leads to some of this. So I think it's useful to not, you know, get too prescriptive, but I think it, you know, there are probably areas that you could have been a little more harsh on, on like things like, no, we need to not do this. Like we should stop doing this. But you know, I think that's a hard call to make too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question, which I'll just put out, and then Olivia, I think maybe has some questions. Which is if there's anything that would make the book more usable for the people you think should use it, like changing the tools, the way it's written in any places, just anything like that, would really, really welcome comments about that as we go into the rewrites.
Have you all decided anything or sort of drafted anything about, you know, to Greg's kind of intervention points, a little bit about what, in addition to, you know, in your own classes usage, have you decided about, we're going to go do a roadshow, not just a regular book tour, but some kind of intervention roadshow? Or Stephanie mentioned website in the chat earlier, like, is that just an idea right now? Like, and just my head goes kind of in those, like, it doesn't have to be like, okay, you guys are going to go on the movement scolding tour, but like, are you going to create the tools? Are you going to do web versions of them? Are you going to kind of design them? You know, all that stuff. Like, that's one way in which the head goes. And then, you know, there's a sort of whatever the teachers, you know, kind of the discussion guide or the kind of trainer's guide of like, hey, here's how you can use this stuff inside your organization, like that, all that kind of collateral possible stuff. Just curious if you all have thought about that yet, or is there capacity, or how will you decide?
Just very preliminarily, we are thinking of doing some podcasts with organizers who are featured in the book, partly because a lot of people won't read a book, and we want some people who won't do that to still get some of the, you know, some of the wisdom, tools on the website, that kind of thing. We haven't really got, I mean, I think we've thought some about promoting it as like a core text for there's a lot of social movement classes that there isn't really a good text for those kind of classes. So we're hoping we can do a kind of strategy around those. And then working with organizational infrastructure to get it around different networks, state-based groups, training groups, etc. We have not contemplated a scolding tour, although I think Kevin has volunteered to be the opening act. But Stephanie might cancel her dates. So yeah. All right, so over to you, Olivia, and then Stephanie put this thing as which is actually kind of important to us, which is just like if there's something you really loved, chapter, idea, whatever, just put that in the chat. So we're trying to get a little map of heat index of what's exciting to folks. So yeah, Olivia.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And to Deepak's point about usability, we did write this with the intention that you don't have to read it linearly, that if you were specifically interested in this model or this strategy, you could turn to that chapter and read it. Of course, we recommend getting that power analysis and the visioning before. But if anyone felt like you needed to read it start to finish, that would be useful to know, because we'd like to be able to create some type of like study guide or toolkit that could just be specific to one part of the book, and you didn't need to read all however many pages it'll be. So if anyone could just drop in the chat or say out loud as I ask this next question, whether they felt like, you know, our intention of letting it be a book where you can pick and choose what you need in that moment is accessible, I guess. Did you all find that? Did it work? Okay. Then my second question is, and this was brought up in our first review session as something that might be missing, and I don't think any of you all mentioned it here today, maybe in the comments on your individual manuscripts, but missing is the role of technology and social media in movement building. And to that end, also like more modern day examples to go, case examples to go with each of the models. A bit about why we chose what we did. Part of it was to make sure that we were, filling in all these check boxes about covering issue areas, demographics, et cetera. But also we didn't want to do too many modern day case examples where we didn't have the time to do like a full-on reflection or analysis of it. But any thoughts on technology, social media, or more modern day case examples that may be missing that you wanted to see in there? That would be lovely to know.
I think it's helpful to just keep it evergreen as it is right now, because you have that full reflection on some of these pieces. So I don't think it misses too much of an analysis there. I do think it's useful to really encourage the tool, like when you're using the tools, to think about how does this apply? Because like these are all the questions that like we're wrestling with. Like, I mean, what do you do in places like Ohio, right? When you have like, what do you do in your cities? And that the one thing I would say that there isn't as much, but I would be interested in, is this concept around governing power and like examples of progressive governance. I know you talked about that, but just, that's something that what does that even look like? We talk about the vision of the world and kind of what we're trying to achieve. And that's still so fleeting, which is, I think, one of the missing pieces and one of the failures of kind of the progressive project generally. So, but as far as like keeping it evergreen, that's fine. I think it's fine.
I was glad. Sorry, Olivia.
No, go for it.
I was glad that there wasn't too much in there about it, because I think the book's going to be used hopefully for a long time, and it's just like hard to have that stuff age well. I mean, if you ever want a good laugh, this is no shade, but you should go read like how the Midwest Academy handbook like talks about like online organizing and the role of email. And it's just like, and like, fine, it's funny, that it was written a long time ago. But I don't know that there's stuff that we can say that's like helpful enough to include it, sort of weighing against the way that it becomes distracting.
Yeah.
Kevin, you don't want to hear me opine about TikTok? Is that what you're trying to say in a polite way?
I do, but I don't think this book is the best forum for it.
In terms of modern day examples, student debt was brought up. Obviously, it's really pertinent right now, but any case examples that you felt like were missing that could have amplified a model more or needed to be covered because it just wasn't and it felt glaring?
We are going to say something about the movement for Black Lives in the conclusion, but that's an example of where it feels like very hard to, it's like it's still in motion, it's not, so it's a little hard to do a lot on it. Yeah. All right, no one leaves without a favorite something in the chat.
I was just gonna say that I didn't feel like this was missing in terms of case studies. I'll just say what's coming to me, which might be totally off base from where you all want to go. But part of me feels like the toolkit itself, just like what Deepak said before about actually what power is versus how we build or wield it, are like two distinct questions. And that I think how we build and wield it could potentially go in a toolkit, which, as I say, that feels like it would need to be more like a workbook. And there's lots of books that have a corresponding workbook that's like pretty comprehensive and could include facilitation guides, or like Stephanie said earlier, syllabi, that gives people not just like a toolkit, but like an actually sequenced way of doing these things. And I think that's where some of the stuff around social media and contemporary examples could come in, as like, this is how you build or do or wield this power, rather than in the book itself. Just an idea. And I just have to say, because I really felt genuinely emotional reading this book, that we've deserved this book for a really long time. Like, I don't have a single part of the book that is my favorite. The fact that the book exists to me is low-key a miracle. There are very few people. This is like an actual intellectual feat, what you've done, just synthesizing a tremendous amount of literature in a way that many people can access. And I'm just so impressed. There's not a lot of people who could have known how to write to this audience, and saved us as organizers, like the years and years of time that you all spent looking at this literature. So I just want to extend my profound appreciation for your instincts about what was needed, and like the collaboration between the two of you, the three of you, and everybody else in your crew who did this, because I'm not surprised this book didn't exist before. It was very hard to write. So thank you.
Thanks for that. That's really meaningful coming from you. And yeah, I would love to just, if there's any last words, things people have on their minds before we close out. Maybe something that, how about this for a closing question, like something that you were thinking about as a result of the conversation and or the book, like something that's like really agitating you, that you're like chewing on hard.
Yeah, I would just say, one, I love the combination of your own experiences, right? Like really telling that, like you got this broad historical analysis, you talk about kind of these different case studies, and then you talk about, you weave throughout your own experiences throughout, so it helps people kind of reflect on and learn from you. So kind of what I'm chewing on is like I think just the process, the experiences, right? And like the way you all tell the story, like you make a lot of parts that, like, you know, people are doing the day-to-day, just like not really thinking about it, but you help tie it all together as to why it matters. And so to me, I think like that in of itself is going to be such an important contribution to the work, no matter what the fight is, right? Like that is the work every single day. And so, yeah, I'm just like trying to figure out how you can see yourself fitting into this, and how you can hopefully others like gain respect and admiration of traditions and struggles that you weren't aware of, right? This is also just like a lot of lesson and learning and growth. And I think I'll be continue to study up and reference for a long time. So really excited about this piece of work. You guys, fantastic job.
I really love it. I'm chewing on this like disruption of the notion that like it's someone else's job to think up all the strategy, right? That like someone somewhere else is in charge of like adding all these strategies into like the big smart strategy, and like there's like no one's doing that job. Like that's a responsibility for all of us. And I think that comes through in the book. And yeah, to Lissy's point, like I haven't read that or seen that anyplace else. And it's just nice to get it chapter after chapter.
Go ahead, Dominique.
Okay, thank you. I'm chewing on vision and something that you said, Deepak, around how do you know what you're doing now is pointing in the right direction to this big vision that you have, big bold vision you have for the world. And I really like the through line throughout the book around abolition, and how does that connect to the vision that we have, and not a utopian way, but in a way that is really centering people and the lived experiences of people through like care and love, and like this love ethic that you talk about throughout the book.
I was just going to say, just on your question, that part of what I took away, among the many things I took away that was so helpful, was the ways in which you were prescriptive, you know, with a kind of gentle touch to the, you know, conversation at the beginning of our call. There's just several examples of that I found very very useful and sharp in your all's voice, in a way that I think not too many people could do, given you're just standing understandings across many of these movements, and both the work that you've done here, but obviously whatever the work that you all have done over the decades. There, this, but there just aren't that many people who are situated in the way that you each are, and that you as a team are, that creates the space within which you can say some sharp things, as you do in the book, and be heard. Lots of people say a lot of sharp stuff about each other and aren't heard at all, because obviously I'm not going to read that person's book or listen to anything they say because they're dumb and wrong. And I think, anyway, that's just one thing I took a little bit for myself as I was learning for myself about how do I get better at that in the places where I may be able to get better at that. And anyway, just another encouragement for you all to take up what Greg was saying and go intervene, please, more.
Greg and Samir, I think you two have the last word.
Just to reiterate, great book, tons of great pieces. And are there more creative ways we can do to just bring it into the real human place of arguing with each other across these different, these different lineages, and really make what the book structure is? Just how do we pull that into reality? I think that'll continue to produce a lot of great discussion.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll echo what everyone says. I'm trying to write a book myself on a very different topic, and as someone who's like got ideas, big ideas, like seeing such an ambitious project be executed so effectively is like incredibly impressive. I like, this is really ambitious, and you pulled it off. It's really, I'm like kind of blown away, and you did it very quickly too. But I would say the thing I'm taking away most is actually, like, even though the thing I would press, and I will press in the comments that I sent to you the most, is like how we bring these all together. I think actually the fact you do make such a strong case for it, and I, as someone who's been somewhat more partisan to a few of these approaches, I think that that's a really important contribution. And so, yeah, that's the thing I'm taking away.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie, Olivia, I just want to say for myself, like, incredible gratitude to you for taking this time, and the comments you receive, what we get from you, the ones that are still forthcoming, we'll do our best to, I mean, it's a lot of amazing stuff we've gotten from you, and we'll really honor it and do our best or go into hiding. One of the two, we'll let you know.
Yeah, just so much thanks for all of this. And I mean, it really is the product of our students, working with our students and working with all of you and learning from all of you. So I meant it when I see it as very much a collective project. So the more we can make it useful for your work, that's really the goal here. So thank you so much.
Yeah, all the same. The last time I said what I'm most excited for, besides delving back into this project, is having you all read the final version and seeing all of your thoughts and comments incorporated in it, since it truly is, it's all of us that are doing it. So thanks so much again.
Really appreciate you all. Thank you so much. We owe you one or many.
Take care. Great job, everybody.
Good to see you all. Great work.
Bye. Have a few minutes. Debrief.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Smart people. Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm a little brain dead right now.
Yeah, well, you have to do all that typing, which can be hard to totally connect.
Yeah, I was following along for the most part, but it's all there. The minutes are there. Hopefully it's coherent. And there's somewhat of a table of contents as well. So you can click through and see what these people said about the thesis, etc.
Wow, great. So organized. Yeah, 2 hours is a long time to talk about.
It is, yeah. It felt a little like pulling teeth again at some points, I assume. But like start off strong again and then a little bit trailed off. But I think that's also because people have certain points and then don't have a lot to say about some other things. So
this one felt less pulling teeth to me. It felt in fact, some people were like Greg was putting notes to me in the chat because he's like, I'm trying not to take up too much space. So I emailed those to you. So it might have also been they were like not sure when to jump in, but
yeah,
I felt like there was definitely more structural stuff in this one, like deeper challenges to address, which is okay. I think we need to digest and think it through, and some we can do and some we can't. But yeah, and I was feeling a little less, I was feeling a little unsure up until the very end when people also said, then they started saying, yes, they really liked it. Like I wasn't sure if people liked it until then. So anyways, yeah, I thought that was great.
And Stephanie, the comments from Greg that you emailed, I put them into this document. So they're all in one place. I think what was interesting about this one is I actually thought that way less people had read it than what it turned. Like I didn't think that Greg had read it or Samir, and they both clearly had. So that was nice. And I think with this one, yes, it was less pulling teeth. I think there's more energy until the end, but I'm having a harder time sort of like wrapping my head around how we actualize some of the comments that like were all really good, but sometimes they weren't tangential in any type of way. But I was just like, that might be another project, or it's a really good thought or question, but I'm not sure we have like the space or even the capability to like insert it here. Whereas the first one, I felt like there was more kind of actionable, like you should do this, be more prescriptive, the redundancy of that. But this was like a little bit more wavering and theoretical, which I think is great, but it's like, okay, we're going to go into this whole analysis of what Gramsci is trying to say. I'm not sure that that's, this is the place for that. As helpful it is as like a conceptual framework.
I think I'd have to go back through it. I thought there were some like little brilliant strokes. Like I feel like the vision chapter, I feel like Pateria's comments kind of really help land that chapter and address a lot of the problems in it. And I think the kind of 7 models fitting together, I had kind of flashed into my mind a picture for the conclusion, which could bring back together like what is our current conjuncture, what then would that imply if that was the right read for what we could do and how these different strategies apply, that I thought could be quite interesting and even original. Might get dated pretty quickly, but anyway. So I felt like there was some of that, and then and then there was a lot in the detailed comments that I thought was good individual. So a little daunted by the sheer quantity of it, but that's why we're spending some time together. I know so that's where my head mostly is, like just like computing it all. I'm having a little trouble putting it into a map, and we have one more to go. So
right, I know. I kind of wish we had a day in between to like let it soak in more, but because I have to go now and teach tonight. So and then do a dissertation thing in the morning. So I'm like, ooh.
Yeah, that's a lot.
But we have the video too.
We do,
so
which is great. Yeah.
One question I had just while it's top of mind, because Samir mentioned this, that I found kind of daunting, was using abolition and neoliberalism, using the 7 models for each of that. We did that with the 6 Horses of Power, and I kind of felt like that was comprehensive enough, and that there was some like electoral power where I'm not sure how abolition would fit in quite as I like. Do you all feel like that's a necessary exercise? It was a good point, I thought, as this through line example, but then we don't apply to the models. But
yeah, we could talk about it. I feel like it could be done pretty simply. It could be done even in a paragraph or 2, or it could be done in a chart pretty simply. If we want to. I'm not sure. I mean, that's one of the things where I'd like, because I think there's some trade-offs we have to judge, like the value versus just adding more complex, just sort of, because some of what I heard too was like land this more concretely, more straightforward, bring it home. And I'm a little there's some trade-off between more conceptual clarity, depth, and more just landing some things. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I was torn because I agree with you. We could probably do it. We did at one point think about that, but would it require too much history to like give the context to the conjunction of each of those? So I was torn, but I do want to think about it and talk about it.
mhm.
Because we then said, oh, maybe we could update it and apply it to the current. I don't know, but I think their general point is like, how do these fit together? Like we have to address that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also whether to call them approaches instead of models.
Yeah.
Or, actually there's a lot of things in there to talk about. Whether to say luck or
There's some
not.
things when I heard them, I was just like, it may be true, but we're not dealing with that. I don't know, have their reaction a little bit like that could be true, but if that is true, it's so disturbing that I just can't.
Oh, like
This is why I'm not an academic, because I'm a little bit like sifting for like, I just can't. I can't
Oh,
go down
okay.
that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Like the Pateri comment about they're not the same, like, nope,
Yeah.
you hear that. Nope.
But once on those, like, I feel like we could also add one sentence to say, the cases will not all be the same. They're different. Like I think some of these can be addressed in one sentence. Just you acknowledge it,
Okay.
qualify.
Okay. Well, I'm okay with the sentence.
And I'm ready to take on that Gramsci point because I actually thought that was helpful.
It was I think that could go in the conclusion too.
Yeah.
So
This conclusion is
Okay.
taking a lot of weight. Okay. All right. Good to see you guys. Look forward to tomorrow. Thank you, Olivia, for all the work that went into today. It was so helpful to read the notes ahead of time. Made a big
Oh
difference.
yeah, of course. I'm hoping to have everything done for tomorrow as well, although Shahrazad's on like number 600 for the comments, so I don't know if I can catch
yeah,
up
we've
with.
got some power players tomorrow. So.
Yeah.
We do. All right. Buckle up. See you
All
soon.
right.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.